Mickey Spillane steps out of his apartment building in Woodside, Queens, on the evening of May 13, 1977. He is 43 years old, and for the better part of 2 decades, he has been the king of the west side of Manhattan. They called him the gentleman gangster. He didn't like dismemberment. He didn't like drugs. He settled disputes with a handshake, or, when a handshake wouldn't do it, a beating, and he married into the McManus family, one of the most powerful Democratic clans in the city. He is a long way from Hell's Kitchen tonight, safe across the river in Queens, and that distance is the whole idea. He thinks it protects him. Then 5 bullets find him on the sidewalk outside his own front door, and Mickey Spillane goes down on the concrete, and the old West Side dies with him. Here is what you have to understand about the men who arranged that. In their world, death almost never arrived as a stranger. It came from a voice you knew, a phone call from a friend telling you where to be, a drink poured by a man you'd known for years. That was the whole method, and it never really changed. Keep that in your head, the call from someone you trusted, because by the end of this, it explains everything. Now, the legend of the crew that took Spillane's place says 60 bodies. Some tellings say 100. A gang so bloodthirsty they turned the Hudson into a graveyard and Hell's Kitchen into an open-air slaughterhouse. That's the story that gets passed around. The real number, the one that actually stood up in a federal courtroom, is smaller, and somehow it's worse. Because this was a crew that never had more than about 20 men in it at any one time, and a good share of those 20 were sitting in prison at any given moment. They were convicted of 8 murders. The Manhattan District Attorney, Robert Morgenthau, once put it plainly. He said the gang had committed 28 murders, of which only 5 had ever been solved. So how does a crew that couldn't reliably fill a barroom become, in the exact words of the prosecutor who finally broke them, the most savage organization in the long history of New York street gangs? How do 20 men hold 20 blocks of Manhattan for a decade, and then vanish so completely that the neighborhood they ruled forgot how to be afraid of them? 15 years before Mickey Spillane bled out on that Woodside sidewalk, the man who would replace him was a kid nobody on the West Side bothered to cross the street for. Jimmy Coonan grew up on West 49th Street, the second of 4 children, the son of an accountant who ran a tax office a couple of blocks over on West 50th. That made the Coonans respectable people, by the standards of Hell's Kitchen. And according to the story Coonan himself told, later set down by the writer T.J. English in the book that remains the definitive history of these men, the thing that turned Jimmy Coonan into what he became happened when he was young. He said Mickey Spillane's people grabbed his father, pistol-whipped him, and beat him. Whether it happened exactly that way, only Coonan ever really knew. And I want you to hold it as his account rather than gospel. But it became the story he told himself. And the story a man tells himself is the one he acts on. Spillane had humiliated the Coonans, and Jimmy Coonan was going to spend his whole life making the West Side pay the bill. To do that, a bartender's son needed an education in violence, and he got it in 2 places. The first was a loan shark named Charles Ruby Stein, one of the biggest money men on the street, and Coonan worked for him as muscle and a bodyguard. From Stein, Coonan learned how money actually moved through a neighborhood, how debt worked, how fear could be turned into a payment schedule. The second education was darker, and it's the reason people still lower their voices about the Westies, almost 50 years later. It came from a man named Eddie Cummiskey. Cummiskey had done time, and inside he had learned to work with a knife. They called him the Butcher. What Cummiskey taught Jimmy Coonan was not how to kill a man, because anyone in that neighborhood could kill a man. What he taught him was what to do afterward. Think about the arithmetic of it. If you dump a body and someone finds it, you've got a homicide, a detective, and a problem that follows you around for the rest of your natural life. But if the body is never found, there is no homicide at all. There is only a man who didn't come home. No corpus delicti, no investigation. That was the phrase they lived by. And the way you made a man truly gone, not just dead but erased, was that you took him apart and you put the pieces where the water was moving. You don't buy silence with a single bullet. You buy it with the certainty that there will be nothing left to find, a debt the neighborhood keeps paying every time it looks at the river. The first time Hell's Kitchen understood what this new crew could do, came on November 17, 1975. A local man named Paddy Dugan had killed a friend of Coonan's, and Coonan and Cummiskey killed Dugan for it. What they did to the body afterward became the stuff of neighborhood legend, whispered in the bars for years and later described under oath by men who said they were in the room. I'm not going to dwell on the details because the imagination does more damage than the description ever could, and one image is enough to tell you what kind of men these were. The story that went around, and that later made it into testimony, was that Dugan's head ended up on the bar of a local saloon, propped up, treated like a party favor. You didn't need to hear the rest. Word got around, the way word always got around in that neighborhood, fast and quiet. And once it did, Jimmy Coonan understood the thing that would define every move he made from then on. Fear was worth more than money, and it was cheaper to produce. A crew of 20 men who might take you apart in a bathtub could hold ground that should have needed an army. Then there is Mickey Featherstone, and to understand how any of this worked, you have to understand him, because he was the other half of the whole machine. Francis Featherstone was born on West 43rd Street, the youngest of 9 children, the son of a customs officer. He was small and fair and baby-faced, the kind of young man who looked completely harmless right up until the instant he wasn't. By his own account, he lied about his age and shipped off to Vietnam at 17. Whatever happened over there, and that's his telling, not a matter of record, something in him didn't come home with the rest of him. In 1971, he shot and killed a man named Linwood Willis outside a bar, and a court found him not guilty by reason of insanity. He spent the next several years cycling through mental institutions, and at one point he was strapped down and injected with Thorazine to keep him still. This is the man who would become Jimmy Coonan's right hand, the most feared enforcer in the kitchen. Coonan had the cold head for the business of it. Featherstone had the thing behind the eyes that made people believe every threat was already halfway to happening. There was a night early on, in a bar on 9th Avenue, where the two of them came through a violent scrape together, and after that they were bonded. Together, the calculating one and the volatile one, they became something the West Side had never quite seen before. And here is the part the movie version could never really tell you, the part worth stopping on. Jimmy Coonan spent his entire life planning to destroy the man who put his father in a hospital bed. And in order to get there, he became something worse than Mickey Spillane had ever been. Spillane wouldn't touch dismemberment. Spillane kept drugs off his blocks. The man who set out to avenge the Old West Side did it by burning down every rule the Old West Side ran on. So here is the question I want you to sit with for a second. If you set out to destroy the man who ruined your family, at what point do you stop being the one getting even and start becoming the very thing you swore you'd never be? Would you have felt yourself crossing that line, or would you only see it years later, looking back? Tell me in the comments, because I read them, and this one has 2 real sides. And if you're new here, subscribe. I pull these stories out of trial transcripts and federal records every single week. Now, to take the West Side, fear wasn't enough. Coonan needed permission. And that brings in the new player who changed everything. A man from Brooklyn named Roy DeMeo. By the middle of the 1970s, the Italian mafia had spent decades looking at Hell's Kitchen, the way a landlord looks at the one unit in the building he can never get the keys to. The West Side piers, the construction unions, the gambling, the Javits Convention Center work that was coming, all of it ran through Irish hands, and it had stayed Irish, because the Irish there were too violent and too clannish for anyone to move in on. Mickey Spillane had kept a careful, arm's-length peace with the Italians for years. But Spillane was old-fashioned, and Jimmy Coonan was hungry, and the Gambino crime family, then run by Paul Castellano, saw the opening. Roy DeMeo was a Gambino associate who ran his own crew out of Brooklyn, and that crew had a particular talent, one that would have made even Eddie Cummiskey nod. They killed people and they made the bodies disappear. When Coonan and DeMeo met, they understood each other immediately. They were in the same line of work. Here's what actually happened next, according to the accounts that have followed this case for decades. The murder of Mickey Spillane was a favor. When Spillane was shot 5 times outside that building in Woodside in May of 1977, the hand behind it was widely believed to belong to Roy DeMeo's people, clearing the board so that Jimmy Coonan could inherit the West Side with the Gambino's blessing. I have to be precise here because this story is full of exactly this kind of claim, and the audience for it deserves the honest version. No one was ever charged with killing Mickey Spillane. On paper, it is still an unsolved murder to this day. But everyone who has studied these men lands on the same arrangement. The old king was removed by professionals from Brooklyn, and the new king took the throne as a junior partner to the most powerful crime family in New York. That partnership is the real answer to the riddle at the center of this whole thing. A crew of 20 men could never have held the West Side on its own, but 20 men who functioned as the Gambino family's own Irish murder squad, who could be aimed at a problem and trusted to erase it. That crew was effectively untouchable for years. The deal reportedly handed the Italians a cut of the Westies rackets, something in the neighborhood of 10% off the top. And in return, the Westies got protection, standing, and a steady river of contract work. It also planted the seed that would kill them, because Mickey Featherstone, the loyal one, the West Side kid who had bled for these blocks, looked at the arrangement with the Italians and saw a betrayal. The entire point of Hell's Kitchen, in his mind, was that it belonged to them and to nobody else. Now they were taking orders from Brooklyn and paying rent on their own neighborhood, but that reckoning was still years off. First came the money, and the bodies that money always dragged behind it. And the very first big one nearly ended the crew before it got started, because it was the killing where the famous method failed. Charles Ruby Stein, Coonan's old employer, the loan shark who had taught him how debt worked, was himself owed a fortune around the West Side, and by 1977, he had become a liability instead of an asset. Coonan reportedly owed him something like $50,000 of his own. So in May of that year, Ruby Stein was brought to a bar the crew used, the 596 Club, by people he had no reason to fear. He was shot. And then, following the doctrine Eddie Cummiskey had drilled into them, the crew set about making Ruby Stein cease to exist. They took him apart, and they put the pieces in the water, and he was supposed to do the Houdini, which is what they actually called it among themselves. He was supposed to simply vanish. But the men who dismembered Ruby Stein made a single stupid mistake. They didn't puncture the lungs. And a body with air still trapped in it does not sink. It floats. Ruby Stein's torso came up out of the water. The one rule the entire operation was built on, the promise that there would never, ever be a body, had been broken by nothing more than ignorance of how a corpse behaves in a river. Sit with that. The thing that made these men into monsters was also, it turns out, something they weren't even especially good at. If the Stein killing exposed the flaw in the method, the next one exposed its cruelty. On January 18, 1978, a young man named Rickey Tassiello was killed in an apartment on the West Side over a gambling debt. Now, how much he actually owed depends on whose account you take, and this is a genuine dispute in the record. So I'll give you both and let you weigh them. In the version Mickey Featherstone told, the one that made it into English's book, the debt was around $1,250. At the trial, a different witness, a man named Anton Lucich, in whose apartment the killing happened, testified the number was closer to $10,000. But sit with the smaller figure for a moment, because Featherstone himself never could shake it. A human being was taken apart in a bathtub over roughly the price of a used car. And in this case, the dismemberment served a second, colder purpose. The crew kept Tassiello's hands. The plan, laid out in court testimony years later, was to thaw the dead man's fingers when they needed them and use them to press his fingerprints onto a weapon, to point the police at a corpse for some future crime. And no, I'm not making that up. It's in the transcript. Rickey Tassiello's remains were never found. This was the machine running at full operation. A young man over a debt he could have paid off with a decent tax refund, killed by people he knew, in a bathtub, his hands set aside in a freezer for later. And you have to hold on to who was actually dying in these stories, because the crew never did. Rickey Tassiello was somebody's son. He had a mother somewhere in the city who would spend the rest of her life not knowing where he was. Before he became a lesson in the economics of fear, he was just a kid who got in over his head with the wrong people. The clock on all of it was already running by then, though not one of them could hear it ticking, because every body, every disappearance, every torso that did or didn't surface was quietly becoming a case file in an office downtown. And a crew that rules by fear carries a very specific weakness inside it. Fear works beautifully, right up until the exact moment somebody stops being afraid and starts talking. One man in that crew would eventually stop being afraid. They just had no idea it would be the most loyal one. For now, though, the Westies looked unstoppable, and the one man who felt the ground shifting kept his mouth shut. Mickey Featherstone had been uneasy about the Italian alliance for years. He watched Jimmy Coonan grow closer and closer to the Gambinos, watched the crew take on more contract work for Brooklyn, watched the West Side become a subsidiary of somebody else's empire, and something in him went sour and stayed sour. The absolute loyalty that had built him, the total devotion to Coonan and to the neighborhood, was slowly turning into the very thing that would destroy him. But in the early 1980s, it was still just loyalty, and he was still the most feared enforcer in Hell's Kitchen, and he had no idea that the man he'd bled for was about to do the one thing capable of turning the crew's most faithful soldier into the weapon that ended it. And this wasn't just about one small crew on the West Side anymore either. By the middle of the decade, the Westies were wired into the Gambino family at the very top, and that wiring would eventually pull in the most famous mobster in the entire country. But to understand how the whole thing detonated, you have to start with a single murder in 1985, and a frame-up so cruel and so short-sighted that it blew the crew apart from the inside out. On April 25, 1985, a man named Michael Holley was shot and killed near the Javits Convention Center on the West Side. Holley was tied to an old grievance the crew had been nursing for the better part of a decade. Years earlier, back in 1977, a Westie named John Bokun had been shot and killed by an off-duty police officer during a robbery, and the crew, in their logic, blamed Holley for the chain of events that had led to it. The grudge sat and festered, and when Holley was finally killed for it, the shooter was John Bokun's own brother, Billy Bokun. Now here is the detail that turns this from a murder into the hinge of the entire story. Billy Bokun did the killing in disguise. He wore a wig. He had himself made up to resemble another man, and he used a car chosen to match. He was dressed up to look like Mickey Featherstone. Featherstone was arrested for the Holley murder almost immediately, and in early 1986, he was convicted of it and sentenced to 25 years to life for a killing he did not commit. Now think hard about what that meant inside a crew like this one. Featherstone was no innocent. He had done plenty, and he'd answer for a lot of it eventually. But this particular murder, the one they pinned on him, was a deliberate setup, and the people who built it were his own. The frame had come from inside the West Side. The most loyal man in the Westies had been gift-wrapped and handed to the state by the boss he worshipped, delivered wearing a mask of his own face. And this next part is the one even the men who ran that crew could never explain away, because it's where their entire world came apart over a single bad assumption. They had counted on Mickey Featherstone to take it. That was the code, after all. You go down, you keep your mouth shut, you don't become a rat, you do your time, and you stay a man. It was the one line even the worst of them swore they'd never cross. But they had made an error in their arithmetic, the same category of error as the air left in Ruby Stein's lungs. They had assumed Featherstone's loyalty ran to them. It didn't. When it came down to it, his loyalty ran to the truth of what had actually been done to him, and to his family. They had treated a warning sign as a compliment. They thought his devotion made him safe to sacrifice. It was the exact thing that guaranteed he would burn them all down. Featherstone's wife, Sissy, went to work quietly with the Manhattan District Attorney's office, and she got Billy Bokun on tape. She recorded the man himself describing the wig, the disguise, the whole architecture of how they had framed her husband for a killing Bokun had done with his own hands. With that recording, Mickey Featherstone's conviction was overturned in September of 1986. And then Mickey Featherstone, the most feared enforcer on the West Side, the man who had given the crew everything he had, walked out of that betrayal and did the truly unthinkable thing. He became the government's witness. He sat down with the FBI, and he gave them the Westies, the whole map of it, every body, every method, every name. Everything the crew had ever built on fear now ran in reverse, because the same terror that had kept the West Side silent for a decade meant that when Featherstone finally opened his mouth, he had more to hand over than the government had dared to hope for. Federal prosecutors brought a racketeering case, a RICO case, the law built for precisely this purpose, to take down an entire criminal enterprise in one stroke, the law that made simply being the boss of the operation a crime all by itself. And with Featherstone talking, and with other crew members following him through the door once the wall of silence cracked, men like Billy Beattie and Anton Lucich, the case became overwhelming. The trial transcript tells a story the neighborhood had spent 10 years refusing to say out loud. It was Beattie who gave the jury the line that summed the whole crew up, that the more bodies you had, the more monstrous you looked, and monstrous was the point. In 1988, the verdicts came down, and they were a slaughter of their own. Jimmy Coonan, the bartender's son who had spent his life climbing to the top of the West Side to avenge his father, was sentenced to 75 years in federal prison and fined $1 million. James McElroy, one of the enforcers, got 60 years. Billy Bokun, the man in the wig, got 50. Kevin Kelly got 50. Richard Ritter got 40. Thomas Collins got 40. Even Coonan's wife, Edna, was convicted and sentenced to 15 years and fined $200,000. The prosecutor who ran them to ground called the Westies the most savage organization in the long history of New York street gangs, and the jury agreed with him, and the crew that had held Hell's Kitchen through nothing but pure terror was simply gone, scattered into federal prisons across the country. And for his cooperation, the man who brought the whole thing down, Mickey Featherstone, received 5 years of probation. Then he vanished into the Federal Witness Protection Program under a name that nobody in Hell's Kitchen would ever learn. Think about that ending for the most feared man on the West Side. He would spend the rest of his free years as somebody else entirely, in some town he never chose, a quiet middle-aged man who never raised his voice and never told his neighbors who he'd been. That is the retirement plan this life actually offers, not a penthouse and a nickname people whisper with respect. A new name, in a place you'd never heard of, and the rest of your life spent hoping nobody recognizes your face. There was one final act, and it reached higher than any of them ever had. Around the same time the crew was collapsing, the Westies had done a piece of work that ran straight up into the top of the Gambino family, and it widened this from a West Side story into a national one. It started small. A union official named John O'Connor, with the Carpenters Union, had a restaurant called Bankers and Brokers torn up, roughly $30,000 in damage, because it had used non-union labor. The trouble was that the restaurant was connected to a Gambino soldier who took his complaint up the chain. By then, the boss of the Gambino family was John Gotti, the Teflon Don, the most famous gangster in America. On a government recording from February of 1986, Gotti is heard saying about O'Connor, "We're gonna bust him up." And on May 7, 1986, John O'Connor was shot 4 times in the legs and lower body by the Westies, on a contract that had come down through the Gambinos. The gunman was Kevin Kelly. When the case over the O'Connor shooting finally came to trial in 1990, the star witness against John Gotti was James McElroy, the Westie enforcer, testifying out of a federal prison cell in the hope of shaving time off his 60 years. He told the court that Jimmy Coonan had personally introduced him to Gotti at the wake of a Gambino captain named Frank DeCicco, and on February 9, 1990, a jury acquitted John Gotti of every charge, and the legend of the man they couldn't touch grew a little larger and a little more untouchable. Sit with the irony of it. It was a Westie who tried to bring Gotti down, and it was a Westie's word. In the end, that wasn't enough to do it. Now, the movie. Because if you know these men at all, there's a real chance you know them through a film. In 1990, a picture called State of Grace came out, with Sean Penn and Ed Harris and Gary Oldman, set in exactly this world. An Irish crew in Hell's Kitchen, tearing itself apart as the neighborhood gentrifies out from under them. It's a good film, with a Morricone score, and it had the worst luck imaginable. It opened 1 week before Goodfellas and got buried alive at the box office, which is about as Hell's Kitchen an ending as a movie can have. But here is what you should carry with you when you watch it. The film gives you 2 Flannery brothers, Frankie and Jackie, one the cold and calculating boss, one the wild, unstable loose cannon. Those brothers did not exist. There was never a Jackie Flannery. What the movie split into two Irish brothers was really a partnership between two men who were not related at all: Jimmy Coonan and Mickey Featherstone. The cold operator and the volatile enforcer weren't blood. They were a business arrangement, and in the end, one partner framed the other and sent him to prison. And Sean Penn's character, the neighborhood son who comes home and turns out to be an undercover cop, he's an invention too, written in so the audience would have somebody clean to stand behind. The real story never had a good guy planted on the inside. What it had was a wire, held by a wife at the very last minute. So strip away the movie, and strip away the legend of the 100 bodies in the river, and here is what these men actually were. A crew that never numbered more than a couple of dozen, holding 20 blocks of Manhattan for a decade. Not through their numbers, and not through any real criminal genius, but through a single idea they were willing to carry out more coldly than anyone before them: that a body no one can find is a murder that never happened. They lived on that idea, and they killed enough people with it that a Manhattan district attorney could only ever estimate the true count and admit that most of it would never be solved. Jimmy Coonan is still alive, still in a federal prison, not due for release until the year 2030. James McElroy died behind bars in the spring of 2011. And Mickey Featherstone, as far as anyone knows, is still out there somewhere under his other name. An old man now, the last one who could tell you how it really felt inside that crew, and the one person guaranteed never to say a word about it again. The real question was never how many men the Westies fed to the river. The number is almost beside the point, and it always was. The real question is how a crew that couldn't have filled a single bar room held the entire west side of Manhattan for 10 straight years. And the honest answer is that everyone who might have said something was either in the life, or in the water, or too smart to pick up the phone when it rang. Because that was always how it worked on those blocks. Death never came from a stranger. It came from a voice you knew, a friend on the line telling you where to be, a drink poured by a familiar hand. The Westies built their whole kingdom on the phone call from someone you trusted. And in the end, that is the exact thing that finished them. One last call, recorded by a wife, made sure that this time, somebody was finally listening.